I didn't even have my shoes on. It was 7:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. The air was still carrying that crisp, dewy chill that makes you want to crawl back under the covers, and I was standing on my own concrete driveway in nothing but a pair of gray thermal socks, gym shorts, and a ratty t-shirt. I had a steaming mug of black coffee in my right hand. My left hand was aggressively pinching the bridge of my nose, desperately trying to stave off the migraine that was rapidly developing right behind my eyes. I took a slow, agonizing sip of my coffee. I let the scalding liquid burn my tongue a little bit, just to remind myself that I was, in fact, awake, and this wasn't some sort of stress-induced fever dream. I lowered the mug and stared down. Down at a grown man, a man who was practically on his hands and knees on my driveway, his khaki cargo shorts scraping against the brushed concrete. He was aggressively reeling out a fluorescent yellow Stanley tape measure with the kind of manic, trembling intensity usually reserved for bomb disposal units. 18 feet, the man muttered, his voice practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. He didn't look up at me. He just kept staring at the little black numbers on the yellow metal strip, tracing his stubby index finger over the line where my driveway met the perfectly manicured edge of the city sidewalk. 18 feet, Jack. Exactly 18 feet and looks like a quarter of an inch. But I'll be generous and just say 18 flat. This was Richard, or as the entire neighborhood quietly referred to him behind closed doors, Dick. Dick was the reigning, undisputed, and utterly tyrannical president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association here in Carmel, Indiana. If you don't know Carmel, let me paint you a picture. It's a city that prides itself on having more roundabouts than any other city in the United States. It's a place where lawns aren't just mowed, they are curated. Grass height is regulated with the strictness of a military dress code. Mailboxes must all match. Trash cans must disappear behind precisely measured privacy fences the millisecond the garbage truck turns the corner. And Dick? Dick was the absolute supreme commander of this suburban utopia. Dick, I said, my voice heavy with the exhaustion of a man who just wanted to eat a bowl of cereal in peace. What are you doing on my driveway? And why are you measuring my concrete? Dick finally snapped the tape measure back into its plastic housing with a loud, aggressive thwack. He stood up, dusting off the knees of his cargo shorts with an air of profound superiority. He adjusted his polo shirt, which was, of course, tucked in, and pulled a laminated, severely overstuffed clipboard from under his arm. I am conducting a routine perimeter compliance check, Jack, Dick said, puffing out his chest. And I'm afraid you are in violation, a severe violation. I blinked. I looked at my house. Built in 1994, standard colonial, beige siding, perfectly fine driveway. I'd lived here for 3 years. Violation of what? Gravity? Common sense? Dick's eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't appreciate the humor. He never did. Violation of Covenant Section 4, Paragraph 12, Subsection A, Dick rattled off, not even looking at his clipboard. He had this garbage memorized. Driveway length. The bylaws clearly state, and have always stated since the incorporation of Whispering Pines, that all residential driveways must be a minimum of 22 feet in length. I stared at him. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant, mocking chirp of a robin. 22 feet, I repeated slowly. Correct, Dick said, tapping his pen against his clipboard. To prevent vehicle overhang into the pedestrian right-of-way. We can't have bumpers encroaching on the sidewalks, Jack. It's a safety hazard. What if a mother with a double-wide stroller needs to pass? What if someone in a motorized wheelchair is inconvenienced? Dick, I said, gesturing wildly to my driveway, where my utterly average, mid-sized Honda Civic was currently parked. My car is 14 feet long. I have 4 feet of clearance between my rear bumper and the sidewalk. You could drive a golf cart behind my car and still not hit the sidewalk. Irrelevant, Dick snapped, completely immune to logic. The bylaws don't regulate the length of your vehicle, Jack. They regulate the length of the paved surface, and your paved surface is 18 feet. You are short by 4 feet. I took another sip of coffee. The caffeine wasn't helping. It was just making my heart beat faster, pumping pure irritation through my veins. Okay, I said, trying to employ the voice you use to calm down a toddler who is holding a sharp object. Let's play this out. My house was built 30 years ago. The driveway has been 18 feet long since the day the concrete dried. The property line ends precisely at the edge of that sidewalk you're standing on. The sidewalk belongs to the city of Carmel. I am well aware of property lines, Jack. Right. So if I pour 4 more feet of concrete, I pointed a finger toward the street. I am pouring it directly over the city sidewalk and into the municipal street, which is illegal. The city will literally arrest me and bulldoze it. Dick offered me a thin, utterly joyless smile. It was the smile of a man who had entirely too much power and absolutely zero actual problems in his life. Your logistical issues with the municipal boundaries are not the concern of the homeowners association, Dick said smoothly, ripping a piece of pink carbon paper off his clipboard. The bylaws dictate 22 feet. You have 18. Ignorance of the bylaws, or pre-existing conditions from previous owners, isn't an excuse, Jack. He stepped forward and slapped the pink slip of paper directly against my chest, forcing me to grab it before it fluttered to the ground. That is a formal notice of violation, Dick said, his voice dripping with bureaucratic glee. And a $500 fine. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance and extend your driveway to the required 22 feet. If you fail to do so, the fines will double every week. Eventually, we will place a lien on your property. A lien? Over 4 invisible feet of concrete? You're out of your mind, I laughed, but it came out harsh and jagged. You can't enforce a rule that requires me to break city law. I enforce the covenants, Jack, Dick said, turning on his heel. Extend it, or we take the house. Have a blessed day. He marched off down the sidewalk, his sensible walking shoes squeaking slightly on the concrete, off to terrorize someone whose petunias were the wrong shade of pink. I stood there in my socks, the cold seeping through the cotton, clutching a pink piece of paper that essentially demanded I perform a physical impossibility or lose my home. Extend it, or we put a lien on your house. I crumpled the pink slip in my fist. Oh, it was on. I marched back inside, the door slamming behind me with a deeply satisfying crack. I didn't even bother putting on shoes. I went straight to the kitchen drawer, rummaged through a pile of dead batteries and loose screwdrivers, and pulled out my own tape measure. I needed to see it for myself. 10 minutes later, I was outside again, this time ignoring the chilly dew. I hooked the metal tab of the tape measure onto the lip of the concrete where the garage floor met the driveway slab. I walked backwards down the slope, letting the metal tape hiss out until I reached the edge of the sidewalk. I looked down. 18 feet, and exactly 1/4 of an inch. Dick was right. About the measurement, anyway. I spent the next hour pacing around my living room, the pink violation slip smoothed out and sitting maliciously on my kitchen island. I could just pay the $500. I could, but paying it was an admission of guilt. It would just trigger the 30-day countdown, and then I'd owe $1,000. Then $2,000. No, you don't negotiate with HOA terrorists. I needed to reason with him, Maybe he was just having a power trip. Maybe if I went to his house, man to man, and showed him the actual Carmel City zoning map, he'd realize he was backing me into a corner that didn't exist. I threw on some jeans, grabbed my keys, and walked 3 blocks down to Dick's house. Dick's house was exactly what you'd expect. It looked like a rendering from a suburban architectural brochure. The grass looked like it had been cut with scissors. The mulch was so dark and perfectly edged, it looked artificial. I didn't even make it to the front door. Dick was already outside, aggressively pruning a perfectly innocent rosebush with heavy-duty shears. He saw me walking up his driveway and immediately stiffened, taking a defensive stance behind his mailbox. "Jack," Dick barked, raising the shears slightly. "If you are here to argue about the fine, you need to submit a formal grievance to the board in writing. You cannot just approach me on my private property." "Dick, put the garden tools down," I said, stopping at the edge of his driveway. I wasn't setting foot on his perfectly pristine, undoubtedly 22-foot concrete slab. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to explain reality to you." I pulled a folded printout from my back pocket. "This is the Carmel City zoning ordinance," I said, holding it up. "Section 8. You cannot pave over a public right-of-way. If I extend my driveway 4 feet, I am literally paving over the sidewalk. The city will tear it up and fine me $10,000. Dick didn't even look at the paper. He just glared at me. "I am not the city, Jack. I am the HOA. "The HOA cannot override municipal law," I yelled, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet, sterile neighborhood. "The HOA governs the aesthetic and structural compliance of Whispering Pines," Dick retorted, his voice rising in pitch. "You signed the covenants when you closed on the house. You agreed to 22 feet. You are currently in breach of contract. How am I supposed to fix it without breaking the law?" "That sounds like a problem for a general contractor, not the HOA president," Dick said smugly. "Now, I am asking you to leave my property. You are being hostile." "Hostile? I'm standing on the sidewalk." "You are menacing me," Dick suddenly shouted, looking up and down the street to see if any neighbors were watching. "You are menacing me over a legitimate covenant violation. I am calling the authorities." Before I could even process what was happening, Dick dropped his pruning shears, pulled a massive smartphone out of his cargo pocket, and aggressively tapped the screen. He was actually calling the cops. I stood there, utterly paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. I didn't run. I didn't retreat. I just stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, waiting. It took exactly 4 minutes for a Carmel Police Department SUV to roll silently around the roundabout and pull up to the curb. The lights weren't flashing, but the message was clear. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out. His name tag read Miller. He looked like a guy who had dealt with entirely too many suburban disputes in his career. He let out a long, heavy sigh before he even closed his car door. "All right," Officer Miller said, resting his thumbs in his duty belt. "Dispatch said there was a hostile trespasser threatening a homeowner. Who wants to start?" Dick practically sprinted to the edge of his lawn, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Officer, this man is aggressively confronting me at my home," Dick sputtered. "He is refusing to comply with a neighborhood covenant regarding his property, and now he is out here shouting and menacing me." Officer Miller turned his gaze to me. He looked me up and down. I was wearing old jeans and a hoodie. I didn't exactly look like a cartel enforcer. "Sir?" Miller asked, raising an eyebrow. "You threatening him?" "Officer," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and flat. "I live 3 streets over. This man fined me $500 this morning because my driveway is 18 feet long instead of 22 feet long." Officer Miller blinked. He looked at Dick. Then he looked back at me. Your driveway? Miller asked, his tone shifting from authoritative to profoundly confused. Yes, I said. He told me I have to extend it. I came over here to show him the city zoning laws proving that if I extend it, I'd be paving over the public sidewalk. He refused to look at the paperwork and called 911. Officer Miller stared at me for a long 3 seconds. Then, very slowly, he turned his head to look at Dick. Sir, Miller said, his voice dropping an octave. Did you call emergency services over a concrete measurement? Dick bristled, sensing he was losing the high ground. He was shouting. He was holding a piece of paper very aggressively. So, you're arguing about concrete? Miller clarified. 4 feet of it, officer, I chimed in helpfully. Officer Miller took a deep breath, looked up at the pristine blue Carmel sky, and seemed to pray for strength. He unhooked his thumbs from his belt and pointed a very stern finger directly at Dick's chest. Listen to me very carefully, Miller said, and there was absolutely zero humor in his voice now. This is a civil matter. It is an HOA dispute. The police department does not enforce your neighborhood bylaws. Do not ever call 911 again because someone wants to argue about driveway length, or I will cite you for misuse of emergency services. Am I clear? Dick's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. His face turned a magnificent shade of plum. But he's non-compliant. Have a good day, sir, Miller said, turning his back on Dick completely. He looked at me, giving a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Stay off his grass, buddy. I'm strictly a sidewalk guy, officer, I said, giving him a 2-finger salute. Miller got back in his SUV and drove off. I turned back to Dick. He was staring at the retreating police car, utterly humiliated. He had tried to play the ultimate trump card, and he had been laughed out of the yard. But as I looked at him, I realized something chilling. Humiliating him didn't solve my problem. Dick wasn't going to back down now. He was going to double down. He was going to use every single ounce of HOA power he had to crush me, simply out of spite. I still had a $500 fine. I still had 29 days to find 4 invisible feet of concrete. Reasoning was dead. Logic was useless. It was time for war. I needed a loophole, and I was going to find one if it meant reading every single agonizing, soul-crushing word of that HOA binder. I marched back to my house, locked the front door, and went straight for the dreaded bottom drawer of my home office filing cabinet. Honestly, every homeowner knows this drawer. It's the one where you shove all the paperwork you received at closing, tell yourself you'll organize it later, and then literally never look at it again until disaster strikes. I yanked it open, the metal tracks squealing in protest, and dug past the mortgage documents and the property tax receipts until my fingers brushed against it. The binder. It was a monstrous, 4-inch-thick black leatherette 3-ring binder. The gold foil stamping on the spine read, Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Master Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, CCNRs. It weighed like 10 pounds. It smelled like dust, cheap printer ink, and shattered dreams. I hauled it out, slammed it onto my kitchen island, and cracked it open. The spine made a cracking sound, like a crypt opening. Night 1 was fueled by pure, unadulterated spite and 2 pots of black coffee. I sat on a bar stool, flipping through pages of legal jargon that was so dense it felt like I was trying to read a foreign language. I mean, I guess I knew HOAs were strict, but this was next-level insanity. Short sentences, punchy rules, absolute madness. Section 2.4 mandated that all visible window treatments must be eggshell white or Navajo white. Not pure white. If your blinds were pure white, you got a fine. Section 5.1 dictated the approved species of grass. Kentucky bluegrass only. No fescue. Fescue was apparently the devil's weed in whispering pines. Section 8.9 limited dog barking. I am not making this up. No domesticated canine shall emit audible vocalizations for a sustained period exceeding 4 consecutive minutes. Who is timing the dogs? Dick. Obviously, Dick is out there with a stopwatch timing the golden retrievers. By night 2, I had moved on to sugar-free Monster energy drinks and was aggressively highlighting everything in neon pink. The caffeine was making my hands shake, but I couldn't stop. I was looking for a loophole. I was looking for a crack in Dick's armor. I read sections on mailboxes, on driveway sealants, on the specific approved angles for satellite dishes. Nothing. The driveway rule was ironclad. Night 3, 3:15 a.m. I was literally staring at the wall, my vision swimming. I had a half-empty can of energy drink in one hand and a pink highlighter in the other. My brain felt like a scrambled egg. I looked down at the page for the 100th time. Article 4, Section 12, Subsection A. I read it out loud to the empty kitchen. My voice was raspy. Driveway length is to be determined by measuring the paved concrete surface from the inner boundary of the municipal right-of-way, commonly referred to as the sidewalk, terminating directly at the primary vehicular entryway, commonly referred to as the garage door. I sighed, rubbing my temples. It was a trap. The property line ends at the sidewalk. The garage door is where it is. 18 feet. I flipped the page to look at the architectural guidelines, just out of morbid curiosity. Article 7, Section 8. Any modifications, alterations, or structural changes to the exterior facade of the residential dwelling require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee, ARC. Changes not affecting the exterior facade or the roofline are exempt from RC aesthetic review. I stopped. I literally froze, the neon pink highlighter hovering over the page. I blinked. I read Section 8 again. Then I flipped back and read Section 12 again. Measuring from the sidewalk, terminating at the garage door. Changes not affecting the exterior facade are exempt. Wait, hold on. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. I mean, it could have been the 5 energy drinks, but I am pretty sure it was the adrenaline of pure, weaponized genius hitting my bloodstream. I can't move the sidewalk. That's city property. I can't pour concrete past the sidewalk. That's illegal. But the driveway length is measured from the sidewalk to the garage door. What if the garage door wasn't there? What if I moved the garage door? If I needed 4 more feet of driveway to reach the magical 22-foot mandate, and I couldn't push the driveway forward into the street, I would just have to pull the driveway backward, into the house. I jumped off the bar stool. I ran into the living room. My house had a fairly standard layout. You walk in the front door, and there's a hallway. To the right is the garage wall. On the other side of that drywall is where my car parks. If you walk past that wall, you enter my open-concept living room. The back of the garage essentially shares a wall with the front half of my living room space, right where I keep my television, a really nice Persian rug, and a leather sofa. If I demolished the wall separating the back of the garage from the living room, and I poured 4 feet of concrete right over my Persian rug, and then installed a new garage door inside my living room, my driveway would legally be 22 feet long. I wouldn't be touching the exterior facade. The outside of the house would look exactly the same. The roofline wouldn't change. I wouldn't need HOA architectural approval because I wasn't changing the outside. I was doing an interior remodel. I ran back to the kitchen, flipped open my laptop, and aggressively typed in the municipal zoning and building codes for the city of Carmel. I needed to know if this was legal on a city level. Because if the city said no, the HOA didn't matter. I scoured the PDF of the building codes, residential attached garages and carports. An attached structure used for the housing of motor vehicles must be separated from habitable spaces by a fire-rated barrier, including half-inch gypsum board on the garage side and a solid wood door not less than 1/3/8 inches thick, or a solid or honeycomb core steel door not less than 1/3/8 inches thick, or a 20-minute fire-rated door. I kept reading. Adequate ventilation must be maintained to prevent the accumulation of carbon monoxide within habitable areas. I started laughing. A genuine, slightly unhinged laugh that echoed in the quiet house at 4 in the morning. It was totally legal. As long as I installed a fire-rated door to separate the new parking area from the rest of the living room and ensured there was ventilation, which I could easily do by keeping the exterior garage door open when the car was running. The city of Carmel didn't care if I parked my Honda Civic in the middle of my living room. They classed it as an attached ventilated parking structure. The HOA said I had to extend the driveway. They didn't say the driveway had to stay outside. I slammed the laptop shut. I had my loophole. It was the most ridiculous, expensive, and petty loophole in the history of property rights. But it was mine. 2 days later, I was standing in my living room, looking at Sal and Mike. Sal was my concrete guy. He was a stocky, grizzled guy in his 50s, who always smelled faintly of wet cement and Marlboro Reds. Mike was the framer, taller, skinnier, with a pencil permanently tucked behind his ear and a layer of sawdust coating his flannel shirt. I had worked with them on a few commercial video production sets where we needed custom sets built, and they were the best in the business. More importantly, they both absolutely despised homeowners associations. Sal was currently staring down at my Persian rug, his heavy, steel-toed boots shifting uncomfortably. He looked at the wall separating the living room from the garage. He looked back down at the rug. Then he looked at me. "Jack," Sal said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I just want to make sure I am fully understanding the words coming out of your mouth right now, because honestly, I think I might be having a stroke." "No stroke, Sal," I said, grinning like a maniac. "I am completely serious." Mike pulled the pencil from behind his ear and pointed it at the wall. "So, let me get this straight. You want us to rip out the drywall, expose the studs, cut the bottom plates, saw cut your existing foundation slab, and then," he paused, taking a deep breath, "pour a 4-foot concrete extension slab sloped for drainage directly over where your television is currently sitting?" "Exactly," I said, nodding enthusiastically. "And then, Mike, I need you to frame out a new load-bearing header 4 feet into the living room, right about where the sofa is. And we are going to install a massive commercial-grade, fire-rated glass roll-up door right there, inside the house." Sal took off his battered baseball cap and scratched his head. "You want to park your car in your living room?" "I don't want to, Sal. I have to," I corrected him. "The HOA mandates a 22-foot driveway. I only have 18 outside. I am simply complying with the strict regulations of the Whispering Pines community." I explained the whole thing to them. I told them about Dick, I told them about the tape measure. I told them about the police being called because I was standing on a sidewalk. I read them the exact wording of the CCNRs and showed them the Carmel City fire codes on my laptop. I watched the realization wash over their faces. At first, it was pure confusion. Then, slowly, the confusion morphed into amusement. And finally, it settled into a deep, profound, blue-collar respect for malicious compliance. Sal started chuckling. It was a low, rumbling sound in his chest. Wait, so from the street his house looks exactly the same. But when he opens the garage door, his driveway just keeps going. Right into his house? Legally, yes, I said. The new interior fire door becomes the primary vehicular entryway, thus measuring from the sidewalk to the new door 22 feet. Mike slapped his leg and barked out a laugh. That is the dumbest thing I have ever heard in my entire life. I love it. I absolutely love it. Can we do it? I asked, looking between them. Sal put his hat back on and crossed his arms. Oh, we can do it. Getting the concrete truck backed up to the garage is easy. Tying the new slab into the existing foundation with rebar dowels so it doesn't crack. That's standard. The slope is tricky because we gotta make sure if your car drips water or snow melts, it rolls back out the front of the house and doesn't flood your kitchen. But yeah, we can do it. And the framing? I asked Mike. I can frame out the new header in a day, Mike said, tapping his pencil against his clipboard. The fire-rated glass roll-up door is gonna cost you a pretty penny, though. Those commercial ones ain't cheap. I don't care, I said. I literally don't care what it costs. It is worth every single penny to see the look on Dick's face when he tries to fine me. Sal looked at Mike. Mike looked at Sal. They both nodded. Jack, Sal said, a massive grin spreading across his face. For a project with this level of pure, unadulterated spite, I'm giving you the contractor's discount. Let's go get some permits. Getting the permits was honestly the part I was most nervous about. You can read the zoning code all you want, but at the end of the day, you are still at the mercy of the clerk at the city planning office. The next morning, I walked into the Carmel Municipal Building with a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints that Mike had drafted up overnight. I pulled a ticket, waited for 20 minutes, and then walked up to the counter. The clerk behind the glass was a woman named Barb. She looked like she had been stamping building permits since the Reagan administration. She peered at me over the rim of her reading glasses. "What you got, hon?" Barb asked, looking bored. "I need to pull a permit for an interior structural modification and an attached parking extension," I said, sliding the blueprints under the glass partition. Barb unrolled the blueprints and weighed the corners down with a stapler and a tape dispenser. She traced her finger over Mike's clean, precise lines. She looked at the existing garage layout. She looked at the proposed demolition line. She looked at the new concrete slab labeled interior carport. She stopped. She looked up at me. "Honey," Barb said slowly, "did your architect make a mistake here? This line indicates you are pulling the garage wall 4 feet into your living room." "That is correct, Barb," I said, keeping my face completely deadpan. "And you are installing a commercial fire-rated glass partition in the middle of the house?" "Also correct. It meets all municipal fire codes for an attached ventilated parking structure. Section 8 of the Residential Code. Gypsum board separation, 20-minute fire-rated barrier. I'm actually exceeding the fire rating by using the commercial glass." Barb took off her glasses. She leaned forward, squinting at me. Why in the good Lord's name do you want to park your car in your living room, sweetheart? I leaned closer to the glass. Barb, I whispered conspiratorially. My HOA says my driveway is too short, but they also say I can't change the outside of my house without permission. And the city says I can't pave over the sidewalk. Barb stared at me for a second. The gears in her head turned. She looked back down at the blueprints. She looked at the property line. She looked at the HOA notation I had conveniently included in the margins. Suddenly, a massive, brilliant smile broke across Barb's face. "Oh, honey," Barb breathed, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce admiration. "You are pulling a fast one on the HOA, aren't you?" "I am simply complying with their regulations to the best of my physical and legal ability, Barb," I replied innocently. Barb grabbed her red, approved stamp with the speed of a gunfighter. She slammed it down on the blueprint so hard the glass partition rattled. "I hate HOAs," Barb declared, signing her name across the stamp with a flourish. "My sister lives in one over in Fisher's. They fined her $50 last week because her seasonal wreath was too robust. You go give 'em hell, Jack." She slid the approved permits back under the glass. I walked out of the municipal building feeling like I had just robbed a bank and gotten away with it. The trap was set. The legal groundwork was flawless. The permits were pulled. All that was left was the demolition. Tuesday morning, 7:55 a.m. I was standing in my driveway, holding a mug of black coffee, watching Sal and Mike unload their trucks. Honestly, the air was crackling with the kind of electric anticipation you usually only feel before a major sporting event. Or a bank heist. I mean, we were basically about to commit suburban treason, so I guess the vibe was appropriate. Sal's crew had already backed a massive flatbed truck into the driveway. They were pulling out heavy-duty concrete saws, sledgehammers, and a literal jackhammer, the kind that runs on a deafening air compressor. Mike was organizing a stack of 2x4s and massive structural headers on the lawn, checking his watch every 30 seconds. 5 minutes, Mike said, grinning around his pencil. Bylaws say no heavy machinery noise before 8 in the morning, right? Section 3, paragraph 2, I confirmed, taking a sip of coffee. Noise ordinances are strictly enforced. We wouldn't want to violate the covenants, now would we? Sal chuckled, sparking a lighter and taking a long drag from a cigarette. He exhaled a cloud of smoke that mingled with the cool morning air. Honestly, Jack, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've built custom homes, poured foundations for skyscrapers, done emergency bridge repair in the middle of the night. But this is literally the most excited I have ever been for a demolition. Just wait until Dick shows up, I said, checking my phone. 7:58 a.m. He's got this internal radar for joy. The second someone in this neighborhood starts having fun or altering a structure, he senses a disturbance in the force. Let him come, Sal grunted, tossing his cigarette onto the concrete and crushing it under his steel-toed boot. He picked up the butt and put it in his pocket. Didn't want to give Dick any ammunition for a littering fine. 7:59 a.m. The crew stood around the compressor, hands on the ignition switches, looking like a pit crew waiting for the green flag. I mean, it was beautiful. 8 o'clock a.m. Hit it, I said. Sal yanked the cord on the air compressor. It roared to life with a deafening, vibrating rattle that shook the fillings in my teeth. His lead guy, a massive dude named Hector, revved up a masonry saw with a diamond-tipped blade that looked like it belonged on a medieval battlefield. They marched into the garage. I followed them, standing safely near the front bumper of my Civic. Hector didn't hesitate. He plunged the screaming diamond blade directly into the drywall, separating the garage from my living room. A massive cloud of white gypsum dust exploded into the air. The sound was unbelievable. It was a high-pitched, shrieking roar of destruction that echoed off the concrete walls of the garage and spilled out into the pristine, perfectly quiet neighborhood. Through the cloud of dust, I could see Mike's guys swinging sledgehammers, smashing through the drywall on the living room side. They were systematically destroying the very fabric of my house. And honestly, it was the most therapeutic thing I had ever witnessed. I was literally paying these guys thousands of dollars to destroy my living room, and I was grinning like a total idiot. Within 10 minutes, the wall was gone. Just gone. Where there used to be a solid wall dividing the garage from my TV and my leather sofa, there was now just a massive, gaping rectangular hole with jagged edges of drywall and exposed 2x4 studs. The morning sunlight flooded through the open garage door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air right above my Persian rug. "All right, clear the floor," Sal bellowed over the noise. Hector dropped the masonry saw, grabbed the jackhammer, and stepped right over the threshold into my living room. He positioned the heavy metal bit directly onto the existing foundation slab, right where my coffee table used to be. Rat, tat, 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 tat. The house literally shook. The floorboards vibrated. The jackhammer chewed through the concrete foundation, sending gray shrapnel flying into the air. We were cutting a 4-foot trench into the slab to tie in the new concrete pour. I was standing there, coughing slightly through the dust, when I saw him out of the corner of my eye, down at the end of the street. It was Dick. He was sprinting. I mean, he wasn't jogging. He wasn't speed walking. He was in a full-blown, arms-pumping, knees-high sprint. He was wearing his khaki cargo shorts, a fluorescent yellow reflective safety vest, because of course he was, and he was clutching his laminated clipboard to his chest like a shield. "Sal!" I yelled, waving my arms. "Kill the noise! Turn it off! The eagle has landed!" Sal hit the kill switch on the compressor. The jackhammer spun down with a dying whine. The sudden silence in the garage was deafening, broken only by the sound of Dick's heavy, frantic footsteps slapping against my driveway. Dick skidded to a halt just outside the garage threshold, his chest heaving, his face a mottled, terrifying shade of crimson. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses, staring at the sheer devastation inside my house. What are you doing?" Dick shrieked, his voice cracking like a pubescent teenager. "What is the meaning of this? Stop! Cease and desist immediately!" I stepped out of the garage, holding my coffee mug, wiping a layer of drywall dust off my cheek. "Morning, Dick," I said cheerfully. "Beautiful day for some home improvement, isn't it?" "Home improvement?" Dick screamed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at the gaping hole where my wall used to be. "You are destroying the structural integrity of this dwelling. You have heavy machinery on site. I did not approve this. The Architectural Review Committee did not approve this. You have not submitted a single blueprint." "I didn't need to, Dick," I said calmly. "Of course you need to." Dick spit, actually stomping his foot on the concrete. "Any and all structural modifications require an RC form, a site survey, a 30-day review period, and written consent from the board. This is an unauthorized exterior remodel. I am fining you $10,000 right now." He aggressively clicked his pen and started writing on a new pink slip of paper on his clipboard, his hand shaking with rage. "Dick, take a breath," I said, leaning against the side of my house. "Read the covenants, Section 7, Paragraph 8. The ARC only has jurisdiction over modifications, alterations, or structural changes to the exterior facade or the roofline. Anything that changes the outward aesthetic appearance of the home. Dick paused, the pen hovering over the pink slip. He knew the bylaws. He knew I was quoting them verbatim. "I am not touching the exterior facade, Dick," I continued, gesturing widely to the outside of my house. "The brick is the same. The siding is the same. The roof is the same. The driveway outside is the exact same. I am doing a permitted, completely legal interior remodel." Dick's eyes darted from the pristine exterior of the house to the war zone inside the garage. His brain was visibly short-circuiting. You just demolished a load-bearing wall," he sputtered. "You can't do that without city permits. It's illegal. You are creating a hazard to the community." "Actually, the new header Mike is installing over there is structurally rated to hold twice the load of the original wall," I pointed out. "And as for the permits—" "I don't believe you," Dick yelled, completely losing his composure. He whipped out his phone. The same phone he used the other day. "I am calling the city inspector. I am calling the police. This is unauthorized, unpermitted destruction of property. You are a menace, Jack." He actually dialed 911. Again. Sal leaned on his sledgehammer, looking at me with a raised eyebrow. "Is this guy for real? He's calling the cops because you're doing drywall work inside your own house?" "I told you," I sighed. "He's got a sickness." We waited. The crew sat down on the tailgate of Sal's truck, cracking open bottles of water, enjoying the impromptu break. Dick paced furiously at the very edge of my property line, strictly keeping his toes on the public sidewalk, glaring at us like we were a cartel operation. He kept speaking in hushed, frantic tones into his phone, occasionally gesturing wildly at my house. 10 minutes later, a familiar white SUV rounded the corner. It was Officer Miller. I almost felt bad for the guy. He pulled up to the curb, put the car in park, and just sat there for a second, staring out the windshield with the 1,000-yard stare of a man who severely questioned his career choices. He slowly got out of the car. He adjusted his duty belt. He looked at Dick, who was vibrating with excitement, and then he looked at me, covered in white dust and holding a coffee mug. "Good morning, Officer Miller," I called out cheerfully. Miller closed his eyes for a brief second. "Jack, what is going on today?" Before I could even answer, Dick launched into a tirade. "Officer, look at this! Look at the destruction!" Dick yelled, pointing his clipboard like a weapon. "He has brought unauthorized heavy machinery into a residential zone. He is conducting a massive, unapproved structural demolition. He is endangering the neighborhood. I demand you shut down this worksite immediately and cite him for code violations." Miller walked slowly up the driveway, his heavy boots crunching slightly on some scattered gravel. He stopped just short of the garage and looked inside. He saw the gaping hole. He saw the jackhammer. He saw the trench cut into the living room floor. He let out a long, low whistle. "That is a big hole, Jack," Miller observed mildly. "Getting an open concept layout, officer," I said, shrugging. "Opening up the space. Feng shui, you know." Miller turned to Dick. "Sir, once again, I am a police officer. I am not a building inspector. If he is doing unpermitted construction, that is an issue for code enforcement, not the police department. I cannot legally stop a man from knocking down walls inside his own home unless he is actively endangering a life." "He doesn't have permits!" Dick screeched, his voice echoing off the neighboring houses. "He's lying! There is no way the city approved a concrete slab inside a living room." Actually, I interrupted, reaching into the front pocket of my hoodie. I pulled out the crisp, official, red-stamped documents I had gotten from Barb at the permit office. I unfolded them carefully and handed them to Officer Miller. Here you go, officer. Official City of Carmel permits. Approved, signed, and stamped by the Municipal Zoning and Building Authority yesterday afternoon. Feel free to review them. Miller took the papers. He scanned the first page. Then he flipped to the blueprint. He looked at the blueprint, then he looked at my living room, then he looked back at the blueprint. A slow, highly unprofessional smirk began to creep across Officer Miller's face. He tried to hide it, biting the inside of his cheek, but I could tell he found it hilarious. He read the notes in the margins. He read the fire code compliance section. Well, I'll be damned, Miller muttered softly. What does it say? Dick demanded, trying to crane his neck to see the paperwork. Show me. Miller folded the permits back up and handed them to me. He turned to Dick, completely deadpan. The permits are in order, sir, Miller said. He has full municipal authorization for an interior structural modification and the installation of an attached, ventilated interior parking extension. Signed and stamped by the city. Dick literally stopped breathing for 3 seconds. He just stared at Miller, his mouth slightly open. An interior parking extension? Dick whispered, his brain desperately trying to process the words. He's building a parking lot in his living room? Looks like it, Miller said. And it's completely legal. So, for the second time this week, sir, you have called 911 for a non-emergency civil issue. If you call us again because you don't like what a man is doing inside the 4 walls of his own legally permitted property, I'm going to write you a ticket for wasting municipal resources. Do we have an understanding? Dick was paralyzed. He looked at the permits in my hand. He looked at the giant hole in my house. He looked at Sal, who gave him a mock salute with a sledgehammer. This violates the spirit of the covenants, Dick gasped out, clutching his clipboard like a life preserver. The spirit of the covenants isn't in the penal code, sir, Miller said, turning his back on Dick. He looked at me, shaking his head. Jack, you are a piece of work. Honestly. I try, Officer Miller. Have a safe shift. Miller got back in his SUV and drove away, leaving Dick standing alone on the sidewalk, utterly defeated, looking like a deflated balloon in a high-vis vest. He didn't say another word. He just turned around and walked slowly back to his house. His shoulders slumped. All right, Sal yelled, clapping his hands together. Show's over. Let's pour some concrete. The rest of the day was an absolute symphony of orchestrated chaos. First, Sal's guys cleared out all the debris. Then they brought in the heavy wire mesh and rebar, laying it out over the newly exposed dirt and tying it directly into my existing foundation with heavy steel dowels. They spent an hour painstakingly measuring the slope, ensuring that any liquid that hit this new floor would naturally flow backward out of the living room and down the existing driveway toward the street. By noon, the concrete truck arrived. Honestly, watching a massive cement mixer back up into your residential driveway is intimidating enough. But watching them extend the metal chute through your garage door, past the old wall line, and directly into the space where you usually watch Netflix? That is an out-of-body experience. The neighborhood was absolutely fascinated. People I had never even spoken to were suddenly walking their dogs past my house 3-4 times an hour, just staring into the open garage. I saw Mrs. Higgins from across the street literally taking pictures with her iPad. It was the biggest scandal to hit Whispering Pines since someone painted their front door a slightly non-compliant shade of maroon in 2018. The wet concrete poured down the chute in a thick gray sludge, burying my old subfloor forever. Sal and Hector were in there with rubber boots and long trowels, smoothing it out, working the edges, ensuring it married perfectly to the old garage slab. "Look at that," Sal said proudly, wiping sweat off his brow as he stared at the smooth, wet, perfectly sloped surface. "That is a piece of art, Jack. You could eat off that. Well, maybe not eat, but you can definitely park a Civic on it." While the concrete was setting, Mike and his framing crew went to work on the structural side. They hoisted a massive, engineered wooden beam up to the ceiling, securing it across the new 4-foot gap to bear the load of the second floor. Then they started framing out the new interior wall. They weren't just building a wall, though. They were framing the housing for the piece de résistance. At 3:15 p.m., a flatbed delivery truck arrived from a commercial door supply company out of Indianapolis. It took 4 guys to carry the massive, heavily crated package up the driveway. We unboxed it right there on the lawn. It was a custom-ordered, commercial-grade, fire-rated glass aluminum roll-up door. The kind you usually see at fancy auto dealerships or high-end modern fire stations. It was constructed of heavy, black, anodized aluminum framing with thick, tempered, fire-rated glass panels. It cost me nearly $6,000, and I literally did not care. "That thing is a beast," Mike said, whistling as he inspected the heavy tracks and the industrial-strength torsion springs. "It's going to look ridiculous inside a house." "It's going to look glorious," I corrected him. Because the concrete needed a few days to fully cure before we could put any weight on it, Mike's crew spent the next 2 days meticulously installing the tracks, the motor, and the massive glass door inside the newly framed wall in my living room. They hung fire-rated 1/2-inch gypsum board on the garage-facing side to comply with the Carmel Fire Code. They taped, mudded, and sanded it perfectly smooth. By Friday afternoon, the work site was cleaned up. The dust was swept. The tools were packed away. Sal and Mike stood with me in the kitchen, looking out over the peninsula counter toward the living room. It was the most surreal architectural feature I have ever seen in a residential home. From where we stood, my living room looked completely normal, until you hit the sofa. Right behind the sofa, the plush carpet abruptly stopped, transitioning seamlessly into a brushed, sloped concrete slab that extended 4 feet into the room. And resting squarely on that concrete slab was a massive, commercial-grade, floor-to-ceiling glass garage door. I hit the button on the new wall-mounted remote. With a smooth, powerful, mechanical hum, the heavy glass door rolled up its tracks, disappearing into the ceiling, completely opening the living room to the exterior garage. "I mean, honestly," Mike said, shaking his head in disbelief, "if you put some neon lights out there, it kinda looks like a high-end bachelor pad. Like you're displaying your car as art." "It's a 2017 Honda Civic, Mike," I said. "It's not exactly a Ferrari." "Don't matter," Sal grinned. "Legally, it's a masterpiece." I walked over to the threshold. I grabbed my tape measure. I handed the end of it to Sal. "Walk this out to the sidewalk, Sal." Sal took the metal tab, walked down the new interior slab, through the old garage, and all the way down the driveway until his boots hit the city sidewalk. He pulled the tape taut. I looked down at the numbers right where the new interior glass garage door closed against the concrete. 22 feet. Exactly. "We did it," I whispered, the sheer pettiness of the victory washing over me like a warm wave. "It is mathematically, structurally, and legally compliant." The trap was fully set. I paid Sal and Mike in full, tipping them extra for their absolute professionalism in the face of insanity. They drove off, honking their horns as they rounded the roundabout. I spent the weekend thoroughly cleaning the house, moving my furniture back into a slightly tighter configuration to accommodate the new concrete intrusion. On Sunday night, I started my car, slowly drove it up the driveway, into the garage, and kept rolling until the front bumper crossed the threshold and rested precisely 2 feet deep inside my living room. I put it in park. I shut off the engine. I pressed the garage door button on my visor. The heavy glass door rolled down behind the rear bumper, sealing the car inside the fire-rated barrier. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a beer from the fridge, walked over to my sofa, and sat down. My car was literally sitting right next to my television. It smelled faintly of exhaust and hot rubber, but the ventilation system I installed pulled it out quickly. It was utterly insane. It was entirely unnecessary. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Now, all I had to do was wait for Dick to make his move. The 30-day compliance window was ticking down, and I knew he wouldn't be able to resist coming to claim his prize. I mean, waking up that first Monday morning was genuinely a trip. I shuffled out of my bedroom, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, walked into the kitchen to start the coffee maker, and just stopped dead in my tracks. Right there, literally sitting between my kitchen island and my television, was the front end of my 2017 Honda Civic. It looked like an art installation gone horribly wrong. The early morning sunlight was filtering through the front windows, reflecting off the Civic's slightly dusty hood and glinting off the heavy black aluminum framing of the new commercial fire door. I honestly just stood there for a good 5 minutes, sipping my coffee, admiring the sheer, unadulterated pettiness of my own creation. I had spent nearly $15,000 just to win an argument over a yellow tape measure. I guess some people buy sports cars for their midlife crisis. I bought an indoor driveway. The next 3 weeks were surprisingly quiet. Too quiet. Dick didn't drive by. He didn't walk by. I didn't get any more pink slips in my mailbox. But I knew how this guy operated. He was a predator, waiting for the clock to run out. He was just sitting in his perfectly temperature-controlled house, marking off the days on his calendar, waiting for day 30 so he could officially slap a lien on my house. Day 30 finally arrived. A Tuesday. I strategically took the morning off work. I made myself a large breakfast, opened the blinds, and sat on my sofa. I could literally rest my arm on the front bumper of my car while I watched the morning news. It was incredibly convenient, honestly. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the doorbell rang. I muted the TV, stood up, and casually walked over to the front door. I swung it open, wearing the biggest, most obnoxious grin I could muster. There stood Dick. And he hadn't come alone. He had brought the entire HOA Architectural Review Committee with him. 3 older folks who looked like they lived on a strict diet of unseasoned chicken and neighborhood gossip. Dick was front and center, wearing a navy blue blazer over his polo shirt to signify the absolute gravity of the situation. He had his laminated clipboard tucked aggressively under his left arm. "Good morning, Jack," Dick said. His voice was dripping with a faux politeness that honestly made my skin crawl. "Today is the final day of your 30-day compliance window regarding the driveway extension covenant. We are here to conduct the final inspection." "Good morning, Dick," I chirped, leaning against the doorframe. "And good morning, committee. Beautiful day for a measurement, isn't it?" Dick's eyes narrowed slightly. He clearly wasn't expecting me to be in a good mood. He glanced past me, trying to peer into the hallway. "We noted the heavy construction 3 weeks ago, Jack," Dick said, his voice tightening. "However, upon visual inspection from the municipal street, it appears you have made absolutely zero modifications to the length of your exterior driveway. It is still visibly 18 feet long." "You have keen eyes, Dick," I said, nodding solemnly. "Therefore," Dick continued, puffing his chest out, "you are in direct violation of the covenants. As of this moment, the daily fines are retroactively activated, and the board will be initiating the process of placing a lien on this property for non-compliance." He reached for his clipboard, ready to hand me the ultimate doom slip. "Whoa, hold on there, Dick," I said, holding up a hand. "I guess you didn't do a full inspection. I absolutely brought my property into compliance. I extended the driveway." The 3 committee members exchanged confused glances. Dick just scoffed. "Jack, I have eyes. I can see the concrete," Dick sneered. "Unless you somehow developed invisible pavement, you did not extend the driveway." "Oh, I extended it," I smiled. "I just extended it inward. Come on in. Let me show you." I stepped back and gestured for them to enter. Dick hesitated. He looked at the committee members. It was highly irregular for an HOA inspection to move inside the house, especially for a driveway violation. But his curiosity, and his desperate need to prove me wrong, won out. He stepped over the threshold, his sensible shoes clicking on the hardwood floor. The committee followed closely behind him, like ducklings. I led them down the short hallway and turned the corner into the living room. I stopped. I didn't say a word. I just let them take it in. Dick bumped into my back, stepped around me, and froze. The 3 committee members gasped in unison. One of them, a lady with perfectly feathered hair named Brenda, literally clutched her pearls. I mean, it was a classic theatrical pearl clutch. I didn't even know people actually did that in real life. There, resting majestically in the middle of my living room, safely secured behind a massive wall of fire-rated commercial glass, was my Honda Civic. What is this?" Dick whispered, his voice trembling. He took a step forward, his eyes wide, tracing the line of the concrete slab that intruded 4 feet into the living room space. "This, Dick, is my newly extended, fully permitted, city code compliant primary vehicular entryway," I announced proudly. I walked over to the glass wall and leaned against the heavy aluminum frame. You see, the HOA bylaws, specifically Article 4, Section 12, Subsection A, dictate that driveway length is measured from the municipal sidewalk to the primary vehicular entryway, commonly referred to as the garage door. I tapped the thick glass with my knuckles. It made a solid, heavy thud. Since I was legally forbidden by the city from extending the driveway forward over the sidewalk, I simply moved the garage door backward, 4 feet backward to be exact. Dick was hyperventilating again. His face was cycling through colors like a broken traffic light. Red, purple, pale white. "This is a living room!" Dick shrieked, his voice echoing off the glass. "You can't park a car in a living room. This is a health hazard. This is an unapproved exterior modification." "Actually," I said, pulling out my own copy of the CC&Rs and waving it at him, "it is an interior modification. The exterior facade of the house remains completely untouched. Therefore, according to Section 7, Paragraph 8, it is completely exempt from Architectural Review Committee approval. Isn't that right, Brenda?" Brenda looked at me, then at the car, then at Dick, completely lost for words. "And as for the health hazard," I continued, "I pulled the municipal permits. It is completely fire code compliant. 20-minute fire-rated glass, proper ventilation, and sloped drainage. The city of Carmel officially recognizes this 4-foot slab as an attached interior parking structure. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my bright yellow Stanley tape measure, and tossed it so it landed right at Dick's feet. "Go ahead, Dick," I said softly, staring right into his eyes. "Measure it." Dick looked down at the tape measure like it was a venomous snake. His hands were shaking. He slowly reached down, picked it up, and hooked the metal tab onto the heavy rubber seal at the bottom of the new glass door. He backed out of the living room, walked backward through the original garage, and down the driveway. I followed him out, the committee members trailing behind me in a state of absolute shock. Dick reached the edge of the city sidewalk. He pulled the tape taut. He looked down at the numbers. He didn't say anything. He just stared. "Well?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe again. "What's the measurement, Dick?" Dick swallowed hard. His voice was barely a whisper. 22 feet and 6 inches. "Perfect," I smiled. "So I am fully compliant with the covenant. My driveway is officially over 22 feet long. You can go ahead and rip up that pink slip now." This is a mockery," Dick spat, his eyes filling with tears of pure, impotent rage. "You have mutilated your home just to spite the association. I won't accept this. This is a violation of the spirit of the community. I am calling an emergency hearing of the board of directors." "You do that, Dick," I laughed. "I'll be there. Care for a beer before you go? I literally don't even have to leave my couch to grab one from the fridge now." Dick didn't answer. He just threw the tape measure onto the lawn, spun around, and marched down the street. The committee members scurried after him, shooting terrified glances back at my house. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday night at the Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse. Honestly, the clubhouse always smelled faintly of stale coffee and indoor pool chlorine. It was a miserable place. I walked in at 7:00 p.m. sharp, carrying my massive black binder of CC&Rs, my copies of the city permits, and a printed photograph of my new living room setup. The entire 5-member board of directors was seated at a long folding table at the front of the room. Dick was sitting in the center chair, looking like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. The room was packed. Word had gotten around the neighborhood about the living room garage, and at least 50 residents had shown up just to watch the fireworks. I took a seat in the single folding chair facing the board table. "This emergency hearing is now called to order," Dick announced, banging a small wooden gavel that he absolutely bought himself on Amazon. "We are here to address the egregious, malicious, and frankly insane actions of homeowner Jack regarding the driveway extension mandate." Dick spent the next 20 minutes ranting. He projected pictures of my house onto a screen. He talked about property values. He talked about the sanctity of the community aesthetic. He accused me of creating an eyesore, a hazard, and an insult to the very fabric of Whispering Pines. The homeowner has utilized a bad faith interpretation of the bylaws to construct an illegal parking structure inside his dwelling, Dick concluded, practically spitting into the microphone. I motion that the board immediately issues a $10,000 fine for unapproved structural alterations and mandates that the homeowner revert the property to its original floor plan within 14 days. The crowd murmured. A few people nodded. A lot of people just looked confused. "Does the homeowner wish to speak?" asked a tired-looking woman at the end of the table. She was the vice president, and she clearly hated Dick as much as I did. "I do," I said. I stood up. I didn't use a microphone. I just opened my binder. "Board members, neighbors," I started, keeping my tone perfectly calm and reasonable. 3 weeks ago, our esteemed president, Richard, cited me for having an 18-foot driveway. He demanded I extend it to 22 feet. He told me that ignorance of the bylaws was no excuse and that my inability to comply due to municipal property lines was not his problem. I walked up to the table and laid down the Carmel City zoning code. I could not pave over the public sidewalk. It is a crime. So I consulted the bylaws, the very bylaws that Richard holds so dear. I flipped the binder to Article 4, Section 12. The bylaws explicitly state that driveway length is measured from the sidewalk to the primary vehicular entryway. They also explicitly state in Article 7, Section 8, that interior modifications that do not affect the exterior facade are exempt from board approval. I laid the signed, red-stamped city permits on the table right in front of Dick. I hired licensed contractors. I submitted architectural plans to the city of Carmel. The city reviewed them, approved them, and verified that my new interior fire-rated glass partition meets all municipal safety and fire codes for an attached parking structure. I looked down the line of board members. I have not violated a single rule. I have complied perfectly, to the exact letter, with the covenants of this association. My driveway is now 22.5 feet long. I did exactly what Richard told me to do. Dick slammed his hand on the table. You parked a car in your living room. It's ridiculous. It is ridiculous, Dick, I agreed loudly, turning to the crowd. It is absolutely ridiculous that a homeowner has to spend $15,000 destroying his own living room just to satisfy a 4-foot measuring error in a rulebook written 30 years ago. It is ridiculous that our HOA president spends his mornings crawling on our driveways with a tape measure instead of actually improving this community. The crowd actually erupted into applause. Someone in the back row whistled. I turned back to the board, my smile fading. I leaned over the table, resting my hands flat on the wood, making direct eye contact with the vice president. If this board attempts to find me, I said, my voice dropping to a dead serious icy tone. If you attempt to force me to undo legally permitted, code-compliant construction that explicitly conforms to the written text of your own CCNRs, I will not just sue you. I will file a harassment lawsuit against the association, and I will name Richard personally as a co-defendant for malicious selective enforcement. I will tie this board up in litigation for the next 5 years, and I guarantee you, every single resident in this room will see their HOA dues triple just to cover your legal fees. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the cheap commercial carpet. The vice president looked at the permits. She looked at the CCNRs. She looked at Dick, who was sweating profusely. Motion to dismiss the violation, the vice president said quickly. Second, said the board member next to her. All in favor? She asked. 4 hands shot up immediately. Dick sat there, frozen, his hand glued to the table. The motion carries, the vice president declared, banging the gavel herself. The violation is dismissed. The property is deemed compliant. Meeting adjourned. The crowd cheered. People actually came up and shook my hand. Dick didn't look at me. He just packed up his laminated clipboard, his face totally devoid of color, and quickly shuffled out the side door of the clubhouse. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood got a mass email. Richard had resigned as president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, citing personal health reasons. The vice president took over, and her first act was to suspend all active perimeter measurements indefinitely. And me? Well, I'm currently sitting on the hood of my Honda Civic. I've got a cold beer in my hand, and I am watching a basketball game on my big screen TV, which is mounted on the wall exactly 6 feet away from my windshield. Honestly, the acoustics in here are terrible now because of all the glass and concrete, and my heating bill in the winter is probably going to be absolutely atrocious. But every time I hit that garage door opener and that massive wall of commercial glass rolls up into my ceiling, I am reminded of the sweetest, most expensive victory of my life. Never underestimate the power of a loophole, my friends, and never ever let an HOA president with a tape measure tell you what you can't do with your own property.